On December 23, 2015, a cyber attack managed to cut the power to 80,000 people in Ukraine for more than 6 hours. This past Saturday, Sans ICS issued a report on the attack, and its director Michael Asante wrote that the attackers used malware and a denial-of-service attack to blind system dispatchers, cause undesirable state changes to the distribution electricity infrastructure, and attempt to delay the restoration by wiping SCADA servers after they caused the outage. On today's Cyber Chat, we talked to Arbor Networks Dan Holden. He's the director of ASERT, Arbor's security engineering and response team, and we discussed the attacks, the global and political implications of those attacks, and if such an event could happen here in the United States. The reports that I've seen over the past couple days are saying that this is the first definitive case of a cyber attack actually causing an electricity outage. So just wondering your general thoughts on the situation.
This attack has more information behind it than a lot of things before that have been suspected to have been related to some kind of cyber attack. Years ago, there was a outage in Brazil that some thought might be related to cyber, but there's just never been any proof or anyone coming out and saying it. Where in this case, you've actually got them confirming it. And you've also got a political situation where there's no reason why they wouldn't confirm it and, point the finger at, who they believe to be the attacker, given just the political situation between Ukraine and Russia. So it's a situation where they can be the victim, so to speak, and, it's not looked at so much as a failure of the power company or even failure of the victims, where in most cases, of course, it would be. And so that gives them a little bit of air cover, so to speak, in terms of being able to admit to the failure being an issue that was not their own. Whereas in a lot of cases, even if you go back years past, now of course there are laws in place where when there's a breach, companies have to release that information and contact their customers, that sort of thing, right? But if you go back 10 years, that wasn't necessarily the case, and a lot of breaches went unreported. So it's a similar situation possibly. Where, could there have been outages, across the world, for instance, in the past? Yeah, sure. But it's been tough to nail them down prior to this.
I guess I'm wondering if you have a sense of how this actual attack in Ukraine happened. According to some of the reports that I read, it said that the attacker used a malicious software platform known as Black Energy, as well as a piece of malware known as Kill Disk. I don't know if you have any sort of information on this specific attack or how attacks like this would generally occur.
Yeah, it appears to, take a similar approach as to most very, very targeted attacks. So, generally speaking, it's going to be a situation where you need someone to click on something. So generally phishing is a very good way to do this, spear phishing, going after, high profile or a target that is likely to, see something, whether it be a malicious link on a website or an attachment in an email or even a link in the email, which is very typical. Going back to much larger and more dangerous attack like Stuxnet, you had to have someone come in with a USB, and certainly you could do that in this sort of scenario as well. Probably be very easy just to pay someone to walk in with a USB and plug it in. But that also obviously increases your risk. So if you're able to use something like spear phishing, or what's called a watering hole, which is a website that would be very typically used by the employees. So think like an intranet type of situation, or some kind of file share. Obviously that reduces the risk for the attackers. And as long as you're confident in the likelihood of someone, clicking on it or opening something they shouldn't, like a malicious document. So think like a PDF or a Word document or even PowerPoint or Excel. Or even, something that's more multimedia nature like Flash. Any of those kinds of file formats, especially on an older system, have vulnerabilities that can be used. So several different ways that this could be done, but generally speaking, whether you're in Homer Simpson, or even a person, at home, generally speaking, the way you're going to get owned is, by clicking on something or opening something you shouldn't. And that's the likely scenario here.
Yeah, and I saw that Arbor Networks put out a report last month on Black Energy. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on Black Energy or what it is and how it's evolved and how it might be tied to this attack?
Yeah, so at Arbor, we specialize in tracking campaigns and malware families for long periods of time. And black energy's been around since the late 2000s. And it's very typical for a lot of your malware families now to have gone back that far. Malware maturity has really, over the last 5-6 years, has really been about adding new features and just making sure the malware can bypass, security, security measures, software, that sort of thing, right? So making sure they can bypass the antivirus or any proxies that might be there. So, that's kind of the primary goal of attackers. And then just updating, the malware that already exists. So, it's like any kind of, developer, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel when you don't need to. And so a lot of the code that's been written before gets reused, repurposed. And that's generally what we see. Even in the financial world, Zeus, which has been around for a very long time, has spawned many different types of malware, whether it be Criminalica or other things that have come later, like NeverQuest. So these families end up, spawning new generations, if you will. And in this case, black energy gets reused, repurposed, new features added, and that's fairly common, like I said, in the malware world, especially when you've got a really good core functionality that's already there. You end up reusing what's there. So it's proven, it's what they needed, and then it's just a question of who's behind it and why.
Yeah, I wanted to just maybe get sort of a bigger picture view of critical infrastructure and cyber attacks. I guess there's a lot of reporting on there, and it's always tied to cyber war and cyber terrorism and all these big things. But I guess the one issue I've always had is that, if you look at, like, say, the energy sector, there's, thousands of transformer substations, but the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they found that only 30 of those are critical to the national grid. And that's the same, with other areas such as water and all these others. I was reading a report from some congressional research committee, and they said that properly identifying which high voltage transformer substations are critical is a key issue. Otherwise, the electricity sector risks the possibility of hardening too many substations, hardening the wrong substations, or both. And either outcome could increase the ultimate cost to electricity consumers without commensurate security benefits. So I guess that's kind of the one thing. On one hand, you have all these security researchers finding these vulnerabilities that often affect these small utilities. And then on the other hand, you have, reports like this saying, well, we really shouldn't worry about those small utilities and waste resources on them.
It's the classic security problem and, security formula. Until the pain is great enough to cause change, you're unlikely to be able to affect change. And that sort of quote reminds me of the situation we've been in here in the States for so many years, with just now going to credit cards with, a chip. Whereas, of course, Europe has been on chip and PIN for a very long time. But the issue for the credit card companies in the States always was, yes, we know the security here is bad, but we also know it's going to cost us a lot of money to, move to another system. To move to, a chip-based system. And of course, there's going to be a lot of pain and cost associated with all the vendors across the United States to go to that system. And I think, the quote you just provided is a very similar situation. The issue with the U.S. specifically is there's a couple of variables involved. One, it's extremely large. Even if you look at other large countries, Canada, Russia, right, the population isn't necessarily populating the entire country as we are here in the States. So the other issue we have is we also have very old infrastructure in the U.S. You compare a country like the U.S. to a country like India. Well, India's got much newer infrastructure than we are. And I don't know that, most Americans would necessarily assume or think about it like that. But, many of the new, the countries that are developing have newer infrastructure, have very good wireless infrastructure, and are perhaps in a situation where, they could tackle this sort of problem easier. In the States, I would say it's a pretty tough situation. You do have not only, the pure amount, but when you do decide to incur the cost to defend yourself better, where is the best ROI for, that defense? And I think that's the point of the quote, and certainly the situation that we have here in the States. Say you're going to retrofit, a bunch of old systems, that's going to cost. Certainly to replace older systems, that's going to cost. And the issue with power, whether you're talking, U.S. or any other country, is that any of your, your basic sort of, power, water, that sort of scenario, of course, it's all about availability. No one was really thinking about, having to worry about security issues when, they were thinking about how to get to water or electricity or natural gas or any of those sorts of things to a location. So it's just a very after the fact sort of setup, and that just makes it quite difficult. I think this is a very good example for the rest of the world to look at, though. Especially if you're one that does follow politics. Certainly the assumption would be this is a political situation between the Ukraine and Russia that has been ongoing since, the Crimean issue. But if you think about it from, I'm a bit of a Cold War history buff. So if you think about, proxy wars like Korea and Vietnam, certainly arguments in terms of the U.S. and Russia, you could look at Ukraine and Syria as kind of proxy, arguments between the U.S. and Russia. And so the U.S. has now said that they're going to help Ukraine investigate this issue. And I don't think that comes as a surprise to any of us, given the issues that Russia and the U.S. have had over the last few years. And so, I think one that serves the U.S. as, we're going to ally with Ukraine as we have been in terms of, aid or whatever the case might be. But also, it's going to provide the U.S. with any lessons learned, especially as it pertains specifically. So let's, in other words, assume that Russia is at the core of this attack, as some have said, or as Ukraine has said. That is going to perhaps better prepare the U.S. if, for instance, Russia were to come after the U.S. infrastructure. So it's a bit of a win-win from that standpoint for the U.S. But I think if you look at many attacks across the world every single day, whether it has to do with something, terrible like this related to power, or you're just talking about DDoS attacks, or you're talking about cyber espionage, much of the, let's call it, cyber threat landscape is absolutely dictated by the geopolitics, both globally and locally. And it's something to pay attention to because certainly as, average citizens, we see this so much more today than we did, 10 years ago. It's just very out in the open. Many countries don't even deny it, or even if they do deny it, there's certainly a lot of other countries that are willing to point the fingers at them. And then on top of that, you do have the angles of just, dissidents, hacktivism, and also terrorism. So there's a lot of possibilities, and I think the ones related to SCADA systems, our power infrastructure, are certainly some of the scariest. So this is definitely an important story to follow and track as things progress.
Yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts a little more on like sort of the terrorism or hacktivism side, because going back a couple of years, like say 2013, that was when former NSA director Keith Alexander, he famously rated the preparedness of critical infrastructure to fend off a cyber attack just 3 out of 10. And the people I've interviewed now, 2 years later, they give me the impression that we're in a worse situation, because Keith Alexander basically said, well, yeah, they could attack us, but they're not going to be so stupid to make the U.S. mad at them. But now if you have these groups like ISIS and other hacktivist groups or nation states that maybe aren't scared of retaliation in the same way. So I've just seen a lot of articles along those lines. So just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I would absolutely agree with that. You just nailed it. And I think that line of logic absolutely holds true. If you go back, a few years ago, 5 years ago, there was lots of talk about cyber warfare and whether it was real or whether it wasn't and who was involved in that sort of scenario. And of course, China would always come up or Russia would always come up. I've always said, yes, it's the countries or the entities with less to lose that are really the scarier ones. Iran and North Korea, I think, are always at the top of the list, in terms of the U.S. And if you think about it, I mean, I was explaining to my daughter the other day, the last vestiges of the Cold War are Iran and North Korea, essentially. Even Cuba and Venezuela are nowhere near the top of that list any longer. So these things have been going on for a very long time. I think, the good part since the end of the Cold War, of course, is that we do have a very global economy. And the great thing is that global economy ties us all together. In 2008, the global economic crash absolutely proved that to everyone across the world. And of course, we've seen last week, the effects of even the stock market in China and how that affects the U.S. and the rest of the world. So, that is the interesting situation. Yes, that's why I said, it's a whole lot easier for Russia to pick on Ukraine than it would, another country. And that's why it's possibly a testing ground for them. I think the U.S. was probably smart in coming out several years ago and simply saying that, if anyone did come after the U.S. from a cyber standpoint, say someone did come out and take the power down in the U.S., that the U.S. would answer, with, in a physical nature. In other words, if we believe that you came after us in a cyber standpoint, we will absolutely fly over you and drop bombs and missiles. And that, I think, sent a very clear message. I think every other country in the world certainly knows that the U.S. is best prepared offensively. And the investment, I think, in the U.S. has certainly been on the offensive side, not nearly as much on the defensive side. Our the financial infrastructure in the U.S. is probably better protected than much of the other infrastructure, and the ISPs are probably pretty well off in the U.S. But so you can rely on your internet and your banking probably more than maybe your power in terms of what the real assessment in terms of defensive capability is. Now certainly the risk is higher for the internet and financial pieces than it is your power and your water. But yeah, I would say the rating is quite low. I think from a military standpoint, the U.S. is probably very capable and could probably defend themselves, although we still see things from time to time. But yeah, I would say, would it surprise me if we all woke up one day and power was out for a large portion? No. But it also wouldn't surprise me if we were waking up that same morning and there was some kind of geopolitical news tied to that very outage. And so that's why I say that the two are very closely tied together. I don't think we're going to wake up one day and the power is going to be out and we're not going to know why. I don't think it would be a mystery as to why that would happen. But I think what you said was dead on. I would have to agree with the other folks out there. It's going to be an entity, like ISIS. I would say that is certainly one of the more scary types of attackers we could see. We've seen it in the past with Syrian Electronic Army. And if you've got a group that's well funded and has motivation and, quite frankly, has less to lose, that's very scary for the United States because historically we've been able to manage countries via financial means. And certainly you can see that, with Iran and North Korea. But we don't have any good way to answer or control or, put any pressure on ISIS short of military action. So, I would say that's definitely the more scary, scary possibility that, we could see at some point in the future.
Yeah, then my final question to wrap up is, obviously everyone's saying we need to do something. We need to do a better job with critical infrastructure. So I don't know, can you solve the problem in the next minute or two?
No. The SCADA protocols and SCADA systems, and SCADA being the set of protocols that our infrastructure is based on, are quite old, and the systems are quite old. Certainly, I think folks are probably used to the fact that their power company has been around for a very long time, and that the infrastructure has been there for quite some time. And so, and quite honestly, I made the joke earlier about Homer Simpson, but that is also, you are dealing with people that are keeping your power up, and right. So it's not like you have a large IT department or an investment like a large banking entity is going to have at your local power company, right? So it is a much different animal. And it will probably take some kind of state or national initiative in order to start to correct those things. That's just one of those scenarios where you can't just, you're unlikely to solve that at a local level. So the politics will have to gain some kind of momentum in order to really start to solve that problem, which generally means that Americans have to care about it, probably be scared of it, and really have to start to take that sort of scenario seriously. Unfortunately, we've seen this a zillion times before, and as it relates to any kind of security, whether that's, physical security or, look at airport security being a great example. It generally takes, something bad happening for the course correction to happen. That's just human nature. As I always say, you don't scratch until it itches. And, unfortunately, something would probably have to happen in order for us to really get serious about solving it. If you want to look at the bright side, so to speak, of the issue in the Ukraine, it is absolutely proof point that it is possible. I would say it's proof point that it's also not only possible, I would say, for another nation state or let's say a terrorist group or even hacktivism, but honestly, the SCADA protocols and SCADA systems that are out there are not that difficult to start to learn and understand. There are certainly systems that are difficult, and that's why Stuxnet was so fascinating, because that really took, someone or some group that really knew what they were doing. But we've seen many presentations over the years at, DEF CONs and Black Hats and other conferences where security researchers have taken it upon themselves to, learn these protocols, explain them, educate the community, and even demonstrate, publicly how you control these systems and how you might be able to, take them out or, maybe even cause an explosion or a fire. So these things are understood. Even as citizens, you can Google this sort of thing. You can totally learn about it and understand it. So it's not beyond our reach or beyond our level of understanding. Again, I think it's just one of those situations where we're going to end up, having to be proven that it's a serious enough issue that we have to care and spend money and spend time to really start to tackle it. And specifically in the U.S., that will be costly and take some time. I think obviously, our federal government understands that, which is why they've probably invested more on the offensive side than defensive, because they are betting that it's easier for them to control things from that standpoint. Like we said earlier, it's, you can control these things politically and financially, but I not to be a fearmonger or anything, but I think a modern terrorist entity like ISIS, that's actually I think a really I think it's worth worrying about these sorts of scenarios when you look at something like ISIS, and I mainly say that because as time goes on, any kind of unit, whether you're talking about military or government or terrorists or whatever the case might be, the longer any kind of group of people is around, the more investment that is going to incur and mount over a period of time, right? So you're not just going to have a big stockpile of, people and food and guns and look at things purely from a military standpoint. And North Korea is a great example of it. They can brag all they want about missiles and nuclear, but their investment on the cyber side is very, very real. And they've realized it's a whole lot cheaper to go after, an offensive capability in terms of the cyber aspect. And if you had a terrorist organization, again, whether that's ISIS or whether that's, any other organization, just the longer they go, the more investment they have. I think just the scarier it gets, so we could be 2-3 years from now. And if ISIS is still a thing, I'm more scared 2 or 3 years from now, just because they've had so much more time to invest, learn, and build those capabilities on multiple fronts.
Yeah, that's all the questions I have, unless there's anything else you wanted to touch on.
No, I think it's a really great topic. It'll be very interesting to see whether this issue in the Ukraine, it's hard for sure to have any kind of, dead-on knowledge as to who the attacker truly was. Generally, you just have to take a lot of clues and piece them together. And more often than not, your general assumptions are correct. Like I said, it wouldn't surprise me if it is Russia. But it'll be very interesting to see, as time moves on, whether we see more of these, whether it's in the Ukraine or any other countries that perhaps Russia's having any kind of geopolitical conflict with. That certainly builds the case against them. It'll also be interesting to see whether this is maybe a growing trend that happens where other nation states or other organizations, terrorists or otherwise, pick this sort of attack up. And, unfortunately, perhaps we start to see a trend. We certainly saw that with DDoS, going back to, 2007, 2008, with Russia and Georgia and Estonia. So, like going back to what I just said, if it's 2 or 3 years later from now and we're talking about this, hopefully we're not talking about this being the very first instance in what becomes a trend that we see across multiple victims and countries. But there's always got to be a first. This could be it. We'll see.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, as always. Thank you.
And that'll wrap up this week's Cyber Chat. The Cyber Chat podcast is produced by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine their impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. For more information about keeping your business safe from cybercrime, check out surfwatchlabs.com.